Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Internet. My name is Zach Graber, coming to you live from my glorious living room in Washington, D.C. Please try to ignore the giant owl in the background. Today, we are going to discuss a study recently published in Science Advances entitled The Participatory and Partisan Impacts of Mandatory Vote by Mail. First up is an author of the study, Michael Barber, who is an associate professor of political science at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. His research focuses on how constituents influence the policymaking process, whether through voting, campaign contributions, lobbying, or other means. He also studies the formation and use of political ideology in the American public. Next up is co-author John Holbein, an assistant professor of public policy at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. He is an expert in voter participation. His recently released book, Making Young Voters, explores the puzzle of why young people vote much less than older citizens. And last, but certainly not least, Elise Wirkus, a legislative affairs manager at Issue 1, which is a 501c3 nonprofit focused on cross-partisan political reform. She has advocated for additional election funding throughout the coronavirus stimulus negotiations to make sure state and local election officials have sufficient resources to conduct a safe and secure election this November. For the viewers watching live, if you have any questions during this discussion, please go into the comments section wherever they may be and ask away. I will try to get to as many viewer questions as I'm able to a little later in the discussion. Have at it. Now, Dr. Barber, let's start with you. Can you tell me that I am correct in that the main takeaway from this study is that voting by mail in the US does not favor either political party?
Yeah, that's correct. In the study that we conducted, we looked at places that have implemented vote by mail and compared them to themselves prior to implementing the policy, and then also compared them to other places that have yet to implement vote by mail. And basically, we found that neither party benefited in the case in which, when you implement vote by mail, doesn't seem to benefit Republicans or Democrats.
John, can you tell me, why did you undertake this research? What is it that prompted it exactly? It sort of seems to publish right around the most pertinent time, right before this election.
Sure. So we were motivated by two broader forces. So the first is we've seen a number of locations in recent years move to all mail or mandatory vote by mail systems in places such as politically diverse as Utah, which leans conservative, to California and Washington state. So we're really motivated by this broader idea of, once we make voting easier, does it change anything about how election results happen, and also how many folks cast a ballot in elections. So that was our broader motivation. We sort of started this project early on, before all of the COVID pandemic restrictions started. But once the president started tweeting about the potential for mandatory vote by mail systems to influence elections in terms of how many people are voting, but also who is casting a ballot, we thought this was a prime opportunity to explore the question of whether or not the system of mandatory vote by mail, which we're seeing millions of Americans request mail ballots, benefits one political party or the other over the recent past. And like Mike said, our general finding is it doesn't. And in normal circumstances, this system itself is used by Republicans and Democrats alike.
So I know in the study, and how you just mentioned right now, you focused on Utah and Washington State in particular. Is there a reason you focused on those two states?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we wanted to get a sense of whether or not mandatory vote by mail had different effects based on the political background of the state. So you take Washington, it's a state that's predominantly leans left, or at least the majority of citizens identify with the Democratic Party and consider themselves to be liberal or leaning liberal. And then the opposite for Utah, a more conservative state. So we wanted to see if there were differential effects based on the sort of the political terrain that was in place. Another reason that we focused on these two states is we were able to obtain very precise measures of who was casting a ballot and how they were doing so in elections. So in our examination of these two states, Washington and Utah, we were able to explore 40 million individual voting records over time that explored what happened when folks were before they were in a mandatory vote by mail system, after they were in a vote by mail system, as their counties or local jurisdictions change from mandatory vote by mail jurisdictions, or from not having that to moving into having it, whether or not things change. So our paper really affords an opportunity to look across different political contexts to see if there's differential effects there, but it also allowed us to really estimate these effects with a great deal of precision based on millions and millions of voters who have gone through this system of vote by mail over time.
Next up, I have a question for Elise. Can you talk about what the state of play on vote by mail is right now? You've been working with this for a little bit, so I imagine you're a little bit more in tune with what's happening in the country right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting because vote by mail has taken center stage in this election funding fight and in kind of this election discourse we've been having. How are we going to have an election amid the pandemic? But in reality, vote by mail, while it may be a more popular option this year than previous years, is just one of the options most states and most voters have to cast their ballot this fall. So states are preparing in a variety of ways to host a different election, but they're confident they can pull it off and count every vote by implementing measures such as expanded absentee, getting rid of excuses so more folks can vote absentee if they so choose, recruiting younger poll workers. Many poll workers are in an age bracket that is more at risk for the coronavirus or adverse effects of the coronavirus, and investing in larger polling places to accommodate for social distancing. So those are some of the measures that many states are rushing to accommodate and achieve by Election Day, and things are going well, but every state is making their own plan as elections go.
Michael, can you tell me a little bit more about how this study might be a little bit different from previous studies? I know, obviously, as Elise mentioned, this is sort of at the forefront of a lot of political talk right now, but how is this study, sort of different from any sort of previous research politicians might have cited in the past?
Yeah, so there have been studies in the past of vote by mail, and in most cases, these studies have looked at whether it simply increases turnout overall. And our results align with those studies, that vote by mail tends to increase turnout by a few percentage points. Where we go further is by looking at the partisan impacts to see if it increases turnout for one party's voters versus the other party's voters. So that's, I think, a really important extension, especially as states consider this policy. It's natural for state legislators to wonder, if I implement this policy, is this suddenly going to hurt members of my party? And so knowing that that's not the case, I think is a really beneficial piece of knowledge as states consider implementing this policy. Additionally, our study goes even further than prior work by looking more broadly at all of the places in the country that have implemented vote by mail. So we mentioned that we study Utah and Washington, but we also have an additional analysis in the paper that includes Oregon, Colorado, counties of California, and then some counties in Nebraska that have also recently adopted vote by mail. So it's a much more expansive look across all of the jurisdictions in the country that are using vote by mail.
So you said that there was just about a 2 to 3 percentage point increase for turnout. That doesn't seem very big, and I know this is like a pretty big issue of talking about possible the massive increase of vote by mail. Our system can't necessarily handle it. Is there some context you could provide for that? Is 2 to 3 points like actually big, and I'm underestimating this a little bit?
Well, I would say yes and no, and I'll let John follow up on this, because John has done a lot of work in studying ways to increase voter turnout. The way that I would say it is a big increase, because most things that we do to try and increase voter turnout tend to have basically no effect. It's very hard to increase turnout. And so if you can find a policy that increases turnout by 2 to 3 percentage points, that might seem like a small number, but it's very large in comparison to other studies that have tried to do this. Moreover, 2 to 3 percentage points of the entire United States is going to be millions of votes. And so, even a small change in turnout can really be a lot of additional people participating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add to that the way we think about these results is influenced by the current circumstances. So it's important to note that our results suggest that worst case scenario, voter turnout stays at the same level. Now, I don't know about you, but during a pandemic, I'm willing to kind of accept that as a potential or a small win, right? I know ideally we want to increase voter turnout, and I've written a book on how to increase youth turnout. So this is something I care about, but I think it's important to acknowledge that during a pandemic, we might want to adjust our expectations of what we can get. Furthermore, we don't really actually we don't know what's going to happen with this next election. It's possible, given the numbers that we're seeing in 2020 already, in terms of the number of people who are requesting absentee ballots or mail ballots, that this could have a bigger effect now that we're currently in a pandemic situation where it is in some places very dangerous to go out and cast the ballot and be exposed to the coronavirus. So I would just say that if anything, our effects suggest that we can preserve this virtue of keeping voter turnout as it has been in the past, and in the worst case scenario. In the best case scenario, we're talking about a moderate or maybe even a slightly even larger effect on the number of people casting a ballot.
All right, thanks for the clarity. I just want to remind a lot of our viewers that are watching right now, if you do have any questions, either on Facebook or YouTube or on both platforms right now, please do so. Ask questions in the comments, and I'll present those to the authors and speakers here today. I want to get more to the point of how this became a partisan issue exactly. Elise, could you talk to a little bit why this issue of voting absentee or by mail has become so partisan?
Sure. It may be an unsatisfying answer, but it is a mystery as to why it became so partisan so quickly. Obviously, the president has made his point, his opinion clear on this. But I think it's very obvious that the data shows that vote by mail and absentee voting systems do not favor one party over another. It's also curious that we hear the president also promoting absentee voting or choosing to vote by mail in certain states, in North Carolina, in Florida, in other states, in New Hampshire too. So it is a bit of a question mark. And I think how this is playing out nationally and how this is playing out on Twitter is very different than how state parties are seeing this and how state parties and at the hyper-local level are seeing this, which is unsurprising. Things are way less partisan and people have higher confidence in their local government. People have more confidence in their local election official than they do in federally elected folks and representatives. So it's complicated.
Of course. I know one of the partisan talking points is the question of security. Are voting absentee, is it secure? Is there a risk of fraud? I know John might have some expertise on this, but I want to start with you, Elise. Is there any sort of political talking points that you've encountered in regards to voting security in this way?
Yeah, like many voting options, every state is creating their own rules and laws around ballot security and what kind of measures they want to have. Things like signature matching is very popular and maybe more widely implemented in states that have done higher rates of vote by mail or absentee for longer periods of time. So the answer is it's really up to the states how many measures they want to take and how many they can realistically implement by this election.
Mm-hmm. John, I want you to comment a little bit further on it, but we actually have a user question that I think relates, and I'd be curious to hear your take on it as well. This one's from Kim Krasnicki. Sorry, I'm really bad with names here. She asked, do you think voting by email will only make it more easy to commit fraud?
Thanks, Kim, for that question. Just to clarify, this is not voting by email. This is still casting a ballot through the postal service, right? So this is a mail ballot that we're talking about. It's important to note that we've had a long history in some states, as as far back as 20 years of experience with vote by mail systems. So if we take Oregon, for example, who's had some system of vote by mail since about 2000, since that during that time period when millions and millions of people have cast a ballot, there have only been 14 total instances of voter fraud in Oregon, in a state where there are millions and millions of citizens who show up each election. Now, I agree that this coming election is a little bit different, right? The context is a little bit different. But if history is our guide, and it usually is when it comes to these types of things, we can expect that our votes will be counted, that our votes will be safe and protected, and that they will the system will ensure that we're able to preserve the virtues of a fair and just election. The last thing I would mention is in our study, we show that historically, based on the information that we have, no political party is benefiting. So even if it is the case, even if you believe somehow that there is voter fraud that we're just not seeing, that we're not catching, that election officials, despite their best efforts, are not catching, our results suggest that that is not benefiting one political party or another. So I guess that's the two-part answer, right? What we can see is it's very rare to have voter fraud in historically in systems of vote by mail, and then also if there is sort of this rampant level of fraud that we can't see, it's not benefiting one political party or the other. It's a total wash in elections.
John, we actually have another question that sort of pertains to this from one of our viewers. This one's from Hakan. Hakan asked, how are mail-in votes guaranteed to be assessed? You had talked about how it's been historically like there hasn't been cases of voter fraud, but are there any guarantees that we can be assured that this election won't be any different?
It's a great question. So I think it's important to note that just because you cast a ballot at a polling place doesn't mean it's guaranteed that it will be counted. Now, that's a relatively rare instance where a ballot will be cast and then thrown out relative to the number of votes cast. That being said, I think it's important that there are provisions, or there are steps that we can take to make sure that ballots cast by mail are indeed counted. In many states, it's already time to be asking to have a mailed ballot sent to you. So there are steps to take to make sure that your ballot is cast. I do not think it's a wise step to try and cast a ballot twice. That seems very like a bad idea, which comes with certain penalties that you don't want to have in your life.
I heard it was illegal.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks for saying it clearer than us academics. Don't do that, I guess is the message.
No, that's a good way of putting it. Mike, Michael, I wanted to talk a little bit more about sort of the implications for this upcoming election in particular. In that, does your research have any implications for this upcoming election, do you think?
I do think that it certainly has implications for the upcoming election, but I also want to emphasize the limits of our research. And so up until very recently, as was mentioned earlier, both parties were very supportive of vote by mail. You have state-level officials in Republican-controlled states and Democratic-controlled states that were very happy and pleasantly running vote by mail systems in their states. It's only very recently in the last 6 months that this has really become a partisan issue, and largely due to the president and the comments that he's made. If you go down to state level officials, even currently, you still find a lot of Republicans that will say a lot of good things about the vote by mail systems in their states. So I guess the question of, what implications does our research have for 2020? Well, I think an analogy would be, imagine that you study climate change and suddenly a super volcano erupts over Yellowstone National Park. It's obviously going to change the models. It's going to change your expectations about, what we should expect in the future. And I think we can kind of see that the equivalent of a super volcano erupting over the issue of vote by mail has occurred, in that the president has made this a very partisan issue, and he's said, he's said a lot of things about absentee voting and mandatory vote by mail, and that's certainly going to change the way that voters perceive vote by mail in 2020, and we see that that's happening. We see that Democratic voters are more likely now to be requesting a mail-in ballot than Republican voters leading up to 2020. I would note, however, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that vote by mail is going to benefit Democrats more than Republicans, because it means that these two voters are voting in different ways. It doesn't mean that one voter is now more likely to vote or something, anything like that.
We have another question from a viewer that I want to get to, and I think this one might be best for Michael. This one's from Stefan Busecker, or Busecker. Stefan asks, is voting by mail safer against foreign interference? We had sort of talked about, fraud and security, but maybe it's a slightly different element to this, is sort of foreign interference. Is there any way that vote by mail might have any influence over this, or be influenced by it, I should say?
Well, I think that the overall takeaway is that our election infrastructure is very secure. We don't have any systematic evidence of foreign interference in the actual tallying of the election and the votes that are being cast. And that's true both of in-person voting, your traditional polling location voting, as well as voting by mail. And so when we talk about foreign interference, what we're really talking about is not that foreign groups are hacking the election. It's really almost that they're hacking the voters. They're engaging in propaganda, is I guess what we would call it, a few years ago, to influence whether people vote or how they vote or that sort of thing. But we don't have any evidence that actual votes themselves have been affected or changed either in person or in a vote by mail system. And part of the reason for that is that our elections are incredibly diffuse. They're not run at a national level. They're run at a state by state level, and even then at a county by county level, and even below that, precinct by precinct. And so one of the virtues of this very kind of hodgepodge system that we have in the United States is that you would have to systematically attack 3,000 counties at the same time to try and make any sort of change in the election. And that's, I don't know how anyone would, necessarily do that. I think the evidence we have is that it hasn't happened.
We have another question from a viewer. This one I think might, I sort of have a follow-up question as well that I want to address towards Elise. This one's from Barber White. Barbara asks, what are all of you expecting this November as far as votes being counted properly and making sure invalid ballots are not? I know we talked a little bit about voter security and the history of fraud being minimal to non-existent. But I want to get your sort of perception on this, Elise. Sort of like, what are your expectations and issue one's expectations going into this election? And if you're doing anything to help politicians or the public sort of, calm their concerns over some of these issues that we've been discussing.
Absolutely. I think the biggest task we have ahead of us right now is level setting and setting expectations with every American who plans to cast a vote or follow this election, that we will not have the results definitively on election night, most likely. Big states might be called, big electoral states may have the results in by 2 or 3 a.m. on the 4th. But many states and many battlegrounds, which this election came down to in 2016, cannot start counting and tallying absentee and vote by mail ballots until election day. So one of the biggest things we can do is stay patient, start spreading that message that we're not going to have election night, Zoom parties with our friends. Either way, on November 3rd, that's just not realistic. And we're going to need to stick together and remember that this is not the first time we've held an election. Even in a pandemic, we've held elections through both world wars and the Spanish flu, and did just fine. And this one's going to be a little different, and we have to trust our election officials. Trust our election officials to count every vote and give them the time to do their job.
Elise, do you have any other sort of recommendations or suggestions for the viewers that are watching that do want to ensure necessarily like a safe and secure election coming up, is there anything that people can get involved in or participate with, whether it be your organization or any other sister organizations that deal with similar things? Is there stuff that normal people can do to sort of ensure that these issues are not as big of an issue as they are?
Absolutely.
Perceived, at least.
I think for folks who feel safe enough and do not feel like they're super at risk for the coronavirus should be looking to the groups that are organizing poll workers and training poll workers at this time. I think that's a great step for a lot of people to do. And the second thing I would recommend is just talking to your family and friends and making sure that they have a plan to vote and they know when they have to, return their absentee ballot by. If your city or locality is doing ballot drop boxes, you can explore that and see if you plan to vote by mail, you could make sure your vote is returned way ahead of time through the ballot drop boxes. There's a lot of resources out there and outside advocacy groups doing education on this. So do some Googling. It's all out there.
Sounds like good advice. We have another viewer question, but I sort of want to preempt it first, and I'll direct this one towards Michael. In your study, you had mentioned that there was only there actually was a slight partisan bias, or at least the way it seemed in the research, that vote by mail increased Democratic shares of the vote by 0.7%. And we had talked at length about how basically vote by mail doesn't do this massive influx of Democratic voters. 0.7 is still very small, but we also talked about how 2 to 3% increase in voter turnout is sizable. So I just sort of wanted to have you defend in any terms why 0.7 isn't necessarily a large enough number to cause any concern there.
Sure. So this is going to get a little technical and a little statistics of what we're doing, but hey, we're a science organization here, and so I think that's just fine. So the 0.7% is what's called a point estimate. But when we do statistics, our point estimates they come with uncertainty, and the reason that they come with uncertainty is because there's variation across the country in the types of people who are participating. There's variation in the types of places who are implementing this policy. And so statistics is all about estimating uncertainty. And so with that point estimate comes a range of uncertainty. And often we call these confidence intervals. And so in the case of the whether vote by mail increases Democratic vote shares more than Republican vote shares, when we look at the full confidence interval, then in that case, there are some cases where it actually benefited Republicans, and there are other cases where it benefited Democrats. And so because that confidence interval includes both outcomes, some net benefit for Republicans and some net benefit for Democrats, we can't exclusively say that it's better for one party or the other. So what I would say is that we have too much uncertainty to really say that it benefits one party or the other.
So I have one quick follow-up to that question before I get to another point that a viewer asked that I really wanted to get to. We talk a lot about being partisan, and we talk Republican, we talk Democrat, but was third-party voting affected by this at all?
So we also looked at people who were not affiliated with either party. Mm-hmm. So these could be people who are purely independent or affiliated with a third party or something like that. And we basically found that the move to vote by mail had similar impacts for those people as it did for Republicans and Democrats. So basically everybody's probability of turnout was increased by more or less the same amount.
Great. So this leads into the viewer question. This one's from Hakan again. Hakan asks, okay, considering the current polarization about vote by mail, how does one de-escalate the situation? I'm very curious to see which one of you might have a good opinion on this or suggestion. So I'll leave it up to you all to decide who might be best at addressing that.
I'll take a first stab at it.
Go for it.
So I wish that there was a wonder pill that we could take, a magic silver bullet to do this. I don't think there is. I think the president has made choices to take a firm stance on this that's not backed by evidence, and that has consequences. I don't know if it's possible to return to where we were before in terms of perceptions about vote by mail. That being said, I think that's a potential goal of our getting this study out there and doing events like this and informing the public that to the extent that it is possible, that there is this disjoint, that even though there are really differences in perceptions and differences in behavior of requesting of ballots, that it didn't have to be this way. The president, in a way, has shot himself in the foot. Now, it's, like Mike said, it's possible that Republicans will still turn out in person and compensate for that, but it's making it more difficult for Republicans. It's potentially making them less safe. So I don't know if that's assuring or not, but one of our goals is to say, hey, it's important to look at evidence. Hey, it's important to pay attention to the facts here. And in as much as we do that, it doesn't have to be this way. So there's a lot of research in political science about how to persuade people. There's a whole literature from political scientists, David Brockman and Josh Kalla, about how to convince or to persuade people that your view in politics, to your view in politics. And it's a lot about like listening to people, their experiences, where they're coming from, and then having a conversation about sort of your experience. So if you've cast a ballot by mail, you can talk about that and how it was safe and how your vote was counted and it wasn't double counted. I think that's going to be much more persuasive in many instances than even our study, right? So I think that there is some hope. We were really frustrated when we saw the president take such a hard stance that is not based on evidence whatsoever going into this election. But I think there are ways that we can try on the ground to persuade people to listen to reason, listen to facts, listen to evidence.
And that's part of the reason why we felt so strongly about creating this live event, is to sort of bridge that gap of science to the public. This is not necessarily a partisan issue, but this is just sort of, this is data that was sort of put together. So thank you for coming in to talk about that. Elise, I don't want to put you on the spot per se, but John had mentioned some interesting points about Republicans possibly shooting themselves in the foot. And I know your organization is bipartisan, works with both sides of the aisle there. I don't know if you have some certain experiences on the Hill of Republicans maybe being worried about this, or Democrats being worried about this. I was just sort of curious if you could sort of talk about a little bit of the climate on the Hill per se in regards to this, separate from necessarily President Trump's tweets.
Sure, I can respond to that. Ideally, we would be following the expertise of both the Republican and Democratic state election officials that are actually responsible for running elections right now. And I think one way to de-escalate it, to answer that question, is to emphasize the range of options. The reality is vote by mail is not the only form of voting this fall. And majority of votes will probably be cast in person or by early voting. So we still have to remember that. And yes, that may take longer. And yes, we have to continue to bring up, evidence-based arguments about why this is not, benefiting one party over another, or why it's not susceptible to fraud. And if there are instances of foul play, that they're caught because of the rules and laws that are in place. I think another way to de-escalate this is to just remember that, like, our local election officials are often like your neighbor or like your kid's little league coach. These are folks who've been running elections for decades often, and they're going to do it right, and they know how to do it. And I think we just need to go back to that local conversation and go back to the range of options to ensure confidence and keep the peace a little bit.
Excellent. And Michael, I want to start wrapping this up, but I want to ask, what are your next steps? What's the next research project here now that we've established this?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot more that we can learn about this topic, and I think that two things really come to mind. So one is, what on earth is going to happen in 2020. I think there's definitely a need to follow up with this study and to basically look at a kind of case study of the 2020 election and see how did vote by mail go. There are lots of places that are doing this for the first time in 2020. And as Elise said, there's lots of places that are doing lots of different variations on a vote by mail system. And so I think there's really going to be a need in early 2021 to start looking at kind of diagnosing and doing an autopsy on the 2020 election and how all of these policies went. Beyond that, I also think that there's really there's a lot more work to be done in understanding how vote by mail changes people's propensity to vote. So we've shown that it increases turnout by a little bit, and then it doesn't benefit one party or the other. But what we haven't looked at yet is how does it impact old voters or young voters or white voters or non-white voters? Does it have a different effect in primary elections versus general elections? There are lots of different questions that are still left unanswered about vote by mail that I think would be really interesting and important to look into.
And to that note, is there any other sort of closing comments or parting words you want to leave with the viewers today?
Well, I guess the thing that I would emphasize is you should vote. So by whatever means, if that's by voting by mail, great. If that means that you're voting early at your election administrator's office, that's also great. If you're voting in person on election day, then by all means do that as well. So I think the best outcome that we could see in 2020 would be an unprecedented rate of turnout, even with a pandemic going on.
And you, John, any sort of closing comments?
Just building off of what Mike was saying, that one of the areas that we can take, one of the reasons we can take solace in the integrity of our elections is there are literally hundreds of political scientists and data analysts who are looking after the election to see if anything odd is going on. So we're looking at the individual level of who's casting a ballot. We're looking at patterns at the very local level. And this is happening to a degree and with a level of precision that you'd be astounded, the quality that we can do this. So I would also echo Mike's sentiment that it's vitally important to cast the ballot in this election, regardless of who you're going to cast a vote for. Doing so is morally important and our civic duty to do so. So do so in a way that's safe, that helps slow the spread of this deadly virus, as Mike said, but cast a ballot.
Mm-hmm. And Elise?
The only thing I'll add is we got to remember that we're Americans first on Election Day, and while we're counting every vote after Election Day. So maybe turn off the TV, tune into yourself, and while we wait for the results, and stay patient, because we got this. It's going to take a little time, but this is not the first time we've done a tricky election. So we're going to pull this off.
All right, excellent, fantastic. I wanted to thank today's speakers. I think we covered a lot of ground on the topic, and hopefully our viewers learned something. Woo-hoo, U.S. elections 2020. Don't want to get on my soapbox or anything like that, but be informed, be safe, and go out and vote this fall. For our viewers who still want to know more about the study, please go to the link in the description, and you can read the article online for free. We also have a short explainer video on the security risks in online voting that's informative. And for those interested in the work being done by Issue One, please visit www.issue1.org. And again, thank